before I introduce the the theme of the overall series of the talks and the theme for today, Tim and Adrian, would you like to just give us a brief overview of something about your background and what you are currently engaged in, whether that be in practice or in your kind of theoretical work? Adrian, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah. So I'm Adrian Heathfield. I'm a writer and curator. I worked for a long time as a professor in London. I'm working basically on experimental theatre, performance art, experimental dance for many decades now. I trained in theatre but came very quickly towards the visual arts, and my career has kind of oscillated between those areas, both kind of in terms of academic disciplines, but also in terms of institutional affiliations. I guess maybe I should say a little bit about my relationship to the subject as well, which is time and duration, and also our relations, because I guess this subject and my relation, for instance, with Tim goes back really into the kind of mid to late 80s when I was a student and really just coming into scenes of performance art and experimental theatre. I think Tim and I met around about 40 years ago at the National Review of Live Art in Glasgow. And that was a place in which I was very much exposed to a set of practices that were, for me, I think, very much dealing with questions of temporality. So, you know, it was a meeting place of artists coming from different disciplines, some from the visual arts working very much in a tradition of action in real time and space, and others like Tim coming from a kind of theatre inheritance, but sharing, in a sense, similar interests. So that was really my first encounter with durational practices as well, and now what has turned into a kind of durational dialogue with Tim, and then also with Jonathan for maybe, I don't know how many years now, maybe 15 years, a kind of dialogue around practice. So I'd say much of my work has been engaged with that, is a kind of thinking with and beside creative practitioners in different forms. More lately, I've been engaged a lot with museums and in particular advising and consulting on their acquisitions in relationship to performance practices. So in a sense, that is also, again, a kind of engagement with questions of time, how it is that things that are transient, in a sense, can be kept or saved or revived over time in a different sense of duration. So perhaps some of those questions can also come into the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. Tim, do you want to?
Sure. Sure. So I'm Tim Etchells. Hello. I'm an artist. I do a lot of work, and in some contexts, I'm best known as artistic director of Forced Entertainment, which is a collective formed in 1984, based in Sheffield, still working together over this long period. So 40 plus years of group work, making performances, theatre and theatre adjacent, let's say. And then alongside that kind of group practice, I work also as a kind of solo maker, in performance, as a writer, as a sculptor working in visual art contexts on installation and other kinds of projects. I would say a few things tie. It's a big range of stuff, and I think for many years I struggled to understand it as a single practice. So I had that kind of nightmare of, in a sense, having quite a compartmentalized view of what I was doing. But I think over the years, I've started to understand that there's a sort of commonality of fascination and interest in that goes underneath or underpins all of those different things. One of them is an interest in language, in text, whether it's spoken or written. Another is an interest in liveness and in the moment of encounter between a person and an artwork, you know, whether that's a live performance or it's a text on a page. I'm sort of in a way drawn to that performative understanding of what it is to encounter an artwork, that there's a moment of exchange, improvisation, ways of making do, and I think time as a kind of as a material, and as something that one is sculpting or dealing with in across all of those different forms, even if it's an installation, a text installation in public space where you expect that people will probably pass by, so they'll be in the presence of the work for, you know, maybe less than a minute as they pass by on the bus. I still think about that in terms of how time structures and frames and influences the impact and the nature of the kind of relation to the work itself. So time kind of goes across and underneath all of the different formal manifestations of the work, and I think that's that's a concern for me and something that I'm dealing with a lot. Very recently, I was just saying to Jonathan before we sort of opened the doors, let's say, I've been doing this trilogy of works with Forced Entertainment, which are all using lip syncing. So the performers are mute, silent, but they're mapping their bodies to the rhythms of text, and all the texts that we're using are written by me, but then voiced by AI voice synthesis kind of software. So it's this sort of very weird mapping between real physical bodies of the performers and these sort of non-real human-like voices that have some origin in sort of, I guess, aggregated recordings of human voices, but they're not. They're effectively words that have never been spoken. So that's been the thrust of the last three pieces. And again, there's something there of temporality, because you're really dealing with the real temporality of the bodies, and then this sort of artificial human-like temporality of these non-human speaking voices.
Tim, you're slightly, your voice is not breaking up, but your visuals are just slightly breaking up. But it's not a huge problem. But I just wanted to let you know.
Okay.
So the overall subject of this series has been the body and time, and I called this talk Slow Time, and I know it should have been called Durational Time, but the reason I didn't call it Durational Time is because a duration does not suggest length, and I find myself arguing for arguing for an understanding that all duration is valid, whether that be short or long. So I just thought I should clarify that. I know it's not about going slowly, but maybe I can begin with the first question that might then trigger some exchange between you both. what might your objection have been to the fact that I called this slow time? Could it be the right title? Is it the wrong title? Why would it be the wrong title? And what do you think of my argument that all duration is duration? So what is it about long duration? That's several questions, but maybe start wherever you feel inclined.
I can definitely come in on that. Yeah, as soon as I saw it in the titling, I had my familiar experience of ambivalence towards it, and I don't want to kind of critique it entirely, because I do think there is something in my own critical makeup and orientation and way of being that is, I think, very much oriented towards something I might want to call an ethics of slowness. But at the same time, I think it's possibly insufficient as a term in relationship to the kind of array of phenomena that you see in contemporary culture and you know, art practices, let's say, across dance, experimental theatre performance over the last 30, 40, 50 years, dealing with questions of time. Because short or long, slow or fast, I think is not really the crucial question. So when I really got into trying to investigate this kind of question of duration, what I started to understand was that inherent to many of these practices was an impetus to question not just the acceleration of time in contemporary culture, but more broadly the regulation of time by power, by social structures, by institutions, and that one of the methods that artists were using aesthetically to do that work was to draw attention to the spatiotemporal limits of an artwork. So in a sense, I started to think of something that would group artistic practices across a very broad array of disciplinary categories through the term durational aesthetics. But what that would mean is works that are in some way or another, I defined it as using a sense passage to draw attention to time reforming. And so it was that, it's that kind of critical impulse, I think, the idea of altering time, changing time, and in particular changing time as it may be ordered or regulated by certain systems of power, that became really important to me. And that could happen through ultra acceleration, or through slowing down, or through various other aesthetic strategies. But I wouldn't be fixating on slowness as the single means through which that kind of interrogative impulse could take place. So yeah, I don't know if that's a place to start.
Yeah, Tim, do you have any responses to that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I would say, you know, on the one hand, for me, absolutely every length of time is a frame. I mean, you know, so and every length of time does or proposes or makes a demand in terms of how we organize ourselves in relation to it, what its possibilities are. You know, 5 minutes is different than 5 hours. 5 hours is different than 5 days. 5 days is different than 5 years. That so every possible time configuration has its, you know, has its thing. And I suppose as an artist working with that, you makes its demands on you and offers opportunities to you as an audience or spectator. Similarly, I guess one of the things that it intersects with is the sort of either the market or the sort of the economy, the social economy. So certain kinds of durations have a currency in certain contexts, you know, like movies or theatre or whatever. Festivals take a different kind of thing. Biennales take a different kind of thing. So all of these cultural sort of frames can cope with or not cope with different kinds of signatures. And I guess one of the things, just to connect to what Adrian was saying, you know, I think there is a sense in which artists have, and from time to time, you know, invoke time formats that, you know, risk invisibility by posing a challenge to the sort of general way that things are organized. So super long, even super short has its kind of challenges, let's say, to the way the markets are sort of organized. And then of course the markets readjust themselves, and they get to, you know, figure out ways that certain works can in fact be seen. So I think it's interesting to think about how all of that duration stuff plays into different kinds of visibility, whether the works are, you know, really a challenge to a dominant way of like looking, or if in fact it gets incorporated.
Adrian, when you say use the word ethics, what can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the things that's inherent to the orders that Tim is talking about of capitalization is the sense in which what is being capitalized is productive relation. And where acceleration comes in is that obviously if things move more speedily between agents, there can be more accumulation of wealth, right? So one of the things that an ethics of slowness does is to slow the temporality of relations down, right? And you see that in various, you could see that across actually cultural production more broadly, because I know in fact it's now of course being capitalized itself in terms of cultures, for instance, of slow cooking, etc., or you know, self-transformation or space transformation, etc. I'm thinking about, you know, the guy in the Alps who's over 2 years is redoing his shack on the mountainside into,
yes, yeah.
You know, so I think, but I think what is there in a kind of promissory sense in that phrase ethics of slowness is the possibility of interrupting or stalling or creating some kind of glitch in the in not just the speed of relation, but in the automation of relation, to create a kind of different space, basically, between parties or in an exchange that has, for me, would also be in aesthetics to do with a different kind of sense relation, a different kind of which feeds into a different kind of understanding, basically. So I should say actually that for me, one of the interesting things looking, I worked a while ago on sort of histories of durational practice in the visual arts and also in experimental theatre, and thinking about the way that they came about in the visual arts, partly out of conceptual art, but partly also out of body art. One of the things that was very clear in the early dimensions of body art was this idea which came through the phrase endurance art. You know, I'm thinking about people like Chris Burden, or possibly early Abramovich, or even Vito Acconci occasionally. And obviously Tehching Hsieh, an artist who I've worked with a lot. But this term endurance art was very much, I think, in the early days, applied to a certain kind of set of practices that were concerned with a kind of masculinist heroics, and pain was the primary subject. And in the sense, what happened then to that idea of endurance art was that those works were being understood as a kind of surpassing of pain, or a triumph over pain. And what I thought was kind of insufficient in that term endurance art and those kind of frameworks of thinking was the fact that many of these works, either for the people who attended to them in the time of their enactment, or who attended to them through their documentation, that what these works were about were a different kind of sense relation to human mortality. And that wasn't necessarily about overcoming death, but rather attuning to it and in understanding its place in the fabric of life. So I got very interested in that dimension of the value of durational practice, basically its relationship to mortality, and the way in which durational practices could disclose to, let's say, participants in the event, different relationships to time that were less regulated, less disciplined, perhaps more sensed or felt, not organized necessarily by conscious thought. In a sense, things that are disclosing new thought through the senses, through sensory relation. And that I think became my interest. I mean,
Yeah.
it very much corresponds actually with what was being said last time about attention itself, in the sense that in Boyana and Eve's conversation, they're very much thinking about attention as something that is a non-individual act, and also something that is not necessarily consolidating one's identity, but actually, in a sense, opening it.
I mean, I think that's one of the things where I would celebrate your previous title, slow time, and why there is a particular interest for me in long duration is partly to do with the fact that works of long duration, I mean, let's say anything from 8 hours on, 6 hours on, there's a certain kind of incommensurable quality to them, or aspect to them, in that it's hard to see the whole thing. If you stay 6 hours or 8 hours or 24, you are likely to sleep. The event kind of escapes you.
Yeah.
And this idea that, and then obviously on and on then into sort of works of extremely long duration, Tehching's work, for example, you're really taking the work then into this place where it can't be known and can't be grasped, because it sort of, in a sense, puts itself outside of your immediate sort of ability to see. And I think over time it also does things like wearing down on, if you're attending a performance of that kind, it does something to your ability to focus, to concentrate. It changes the way that you're sort of seeing and thinking, and I think that's ultimately the sort of zone of interest, I think, that you sort of focus in on, that you're getting to a less, I mean, it's a form of inefficient attention, and where the object sort of escapes you, the goal, I think, as Adrian's saying, is that it takes you to new places in terms of a porosity between yourself and the experience of the performance, yourself and other spectators. It slightly, it blurs a whole bunch of lines, and I think that's what's, to me, that's what's interesting and exciting about those sort of works, is that they open that slightly other way of thinking about where meaning might be made and how it might be made and in what kinds of relation.
I find it interesting, that observation, Adrian, that the endurance of early durational performance art work may have had a certain masculine underpinning. In contemporary dance, in recent years, there's tended to be a focus on the perhaps on the idea that the audience themselves must endure this long duration in order, or this slowness, in order to be challenged, for their sense of time and attention to be challenged. And I have sometimes had the concern that also has a certain hierarchical masculine tendency, the assumption that I will challenge you, that through the practice that I've invited you to witness. Do you have any thoughts in response to that, Adrian? Does that make sense? Am I getting that wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could, I mean, maybe you could think about it in relationship to, say, something like Faber in the Jan Faber in the theatrical frame, or something like that. One might say maybe there is something of that, though in reality, of course, many of those practices also have a framework, which is that you're free to leave and return as you wish. And so in a sense, they are, as is happening now, in a sense, they are, they have a kind of openness, which is, whilst inhabiting a theatrical frame, is also affiliated with a certain kind of capacity that takes place more readily in the museum or the gallery, where, because they're kind of, those are often perambulatory works, you know, they, you know, and the traditions of the and conventions of the museum are such that the attendant is in fact a visitor who may come and go as they wish, as Tim was pointing out earlier. So I'm not sure. I mean, I think there are kind of counter elements in all of those contexts. I think, you know, one of the, I just wanted to pick up those on something that Tim was saying and try and sort of tie it up into perhaps dance aesthetics a little bit more strongly, which is, and it's also connected to something that was happening in the conversation last time, when Eve and Boyana were talking about dance as being organized by the question of what a body can do. And it seemed to me that, you know, it's quite interesting that the kind of lay sense of that might be to assume that all of these experiments in contemporary dance are really about the possibility, the extensive possibility of a moving body, right? How it can become, in a sense, more than itself. And I think one of the things that Tim's interested in the work with forced entertainment, and also in other venues as well, is in fact what's happening to the body in a situation of exhaustion. And I think exhaustion is a very particular kind of quality in those long durational works where you know, the performer's capacity to be on the mark, to realize acutely, etc., is really in question, and then consequently what's disclosed is a different kind of field. It's very much what Deleuze says about exhaustion, right? That it's, you know, when it's only in the place of exhaustion, when, you know, you're out of choices, out of possibility, right? Out of capacity to realize that something genuinely new and genuinely creative arises. It has this kind of radicality as a kind of turning point that's to do with really pure potential. And I think that's something that is there in a lot of the work that Tim is doing, and it's also related, of course, to a broader kind of aesthetics of failure that the work is interested in inhabiting. And I think that in a choreographic language, that's obviously a very different thing. And though I could think of many points of affinity between contemporary choreographers and those interests, I mean, I think immediately, for instance, of someone like Philip Germacher, in a sense where the subject who is performing is not necessarily in full control of the extension, or there's a sense of hesitation or doubt or a kind of questioning quality to the movement that undermines it.
Yeah. No, I think that sense that specifically long duration is a sort of route with an agenda to take you away from mastery. You know, that you go there because you won't be able to maintain the kinds of control, you won't be able to maintain the same kinds of decision making. Your intentions will be, in a sense, behind you, and actually that opens up a tremendous amount of sort of possibility, not I think in some melodramatic mode of suffering, which wouldn't interest me a great deal, but more in the sense of that there, as Adrian was describing from Deleuze, that is there at your wit's end, when you've no further resources, you do find yourself making extraordinary decisions and discoveries in negotiation with other people. And that's, to me, also interesting, is that a lot of the work that I've done in that frame is social work. I mean, it's, i.e., there are more people on the stage, it's interactive, there's a sort of collective stumbling, which I think opens a lot of possibilities. It's not so much the lone figure against the task, which I think, you know, there's huge amounts of work in that area that speaks to me powerfully, but it's not been my interest. I think my interest has largely been in the sort of what happens to a group who are together negotiating this sort of new territory on the other side of, you know, we always say the first hour of those works is the hardest because it's the one where you're most in touch with your good intentions and your desire to, you know, present your best self. An hour or two in, you're starting to wear the edges off of that in interesting ways, and ways that you can't predict, which is also the interesting thing. I mean, I think a lot of it for me is about trying to get past a certain kind of intentionality. It's in search of, you're setting a frame that's quite deliberate, but you're sort of looking for the moment that the material and the event sort of escapes all of that. That's really the desire.
Can I ask the obvious question though, Tim? Do you pre-decide this will be a long duration and then that determines the process, or might you start work on something and say, this could be a long duration?
I mean, mostly when we've made those longer works, it's been by accident, i.e. we have stumbled into something and realized that there's a sort of generative like logic to them. And the very first one we made, which was for the National Review, Adrian was mentioning earlier, this sort of gathering in the sort of late 1980s, mid to late 1980s, that we used to be going to as young theatre makers. And we saw there, certainly in Glasgow, I think, one year, Alistair MacLennan doing a 72-hour performance in the gallery, which had very many sort of phases and shifts to it. But I remember being absolutely blown away by the sort of unknowable structure and the sort of unknowable intensities and modulations of this thing that he was in there all the time doing, just being really struck by that as a contrast to our 40 minutes of, you know, very precisely honed theatre. And the very first work that we made that was long was a piece called 12 a.m. Awake and Looking Down, which we're still doing. But I proposed it to Nikki at the National Review as a 12-hour piece, basically because in rehearsals for the short theatre piece we were making at the time, I used to find it hard to stop. Like it would be an improvisation that would go on for, you know, an hour, and I'd be unable to intervene in it because I'd be endlessly fascinated by what would come next and what would come next and what would come next. It was very foggy, but I think it was a realization that somewhere in that material there was this sort of churning, dynamic, deteriorating sort of process. We've rarely, if ever, sat down to make a durational piece. It's only ever been that the material arrived in the room and you're like, okay, that can be 6 hours. Like we don't need to. I also love that you could say we don't need to make a shape out of this. The shape will be in the decisions people make to come and go, and in the sort of bioergonomics of 6 hours or something. So you give up on dramaturgy, and that's such a relief.
Right.
You know, as a theatre maker, it's a relief to be outside of that sculptural, temporal sculpture that you're always building across an hour and a half or something, which is tyrannous and sort of predictable in all kinds of ways. It's just it's a joy to be able to say, yeah, it's 6 hours. Nobody's going to be there all the time. It starts when you enter, it leaves when you leave. You know, it's no shape. It's gorgeous. You know.
I mean, it seems important also to say that something, from my experience, something quite profound is happening in the field of reception at those points in duration for the visitors or for the spectators or witnesses or attendants, whatever we want to call them. There is a cumulative sense that takes place that is very different from, it can't be arrived at in an hour. I mean, I'm thinking, for instance, of experiences I've had in your work, Tim, where, let's say, in pieces that have a kind of narrative structure or storytelling structure that's very fragmented, you will find a story being told 6 hours in that is a reference to a story that was told 3 hours ago.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have sat in the place of listening, of attending, the deep sense of resonation from those relations is really profound. And it's something connected to narrative force. It is cumulative, but it's not narrative resolution or a normative narrative function. And I think I could equally talk about that in relationship to choreographic works. And I'm thinking, for instance, of something that I saw a while back, Alex Basinski's Jenkins piece, where, you know, literally the first couple of hours are a real, as intensely, heavily repetitious choreographic work with a very, very slow morphology, sonic choreographic morphology. But something shifts 3 or 4 hours in that feels very elemental, feels very much about a different form of attunement to moving bodies, to one's sense of the meaning of moving bodies, to one's implied sense of consequence of the work, you know. So this is, I think this is something, and it's to do, I think, with the undergoing of the performer, let's say, that one has to undergo something, so, which is a kind of subjection, I think, in a certain way. And then a kind of arrival into a certain kind of sense condition.
Yeah.
Collectively shared.
Yeah. I think the thing that links to that for me is just a perception about as works of longer duration go, and you know, you can say this for long movies as well in a funny way. At a certain point, when the work's long, you get to a point, a third of the way in, a middle of the way in, you're very far from the beginning. You're very far from the end, and your capacity to hold the structure of what's happened is weakened, and therefore, in a certain way, you really don't know where you are, or you've lost the reference points that allow you to see the thing as an object, and I think that's really powerful. It's a certain kind of getting lost, actually, and I think that's for spectator and for performer, that it doesn't have that sort of you know, the neat hour and 15-minute movie that people used to make, or the hour and 10-minute long show. That, I mean, and no knocking those things, because there's a sort of clockwork to those that also does its thing. But I'm interested in that sense that these longer works, one of the things they do is they challenge your ability to sort of map structure, and maybe also your brain tunes in a different way as a spectator. So you stop clinging to the landmarks, and you sort of ooze into the space and time of it in a different way. And I think there's something very valuable in that.
Tim, how do you, as the person that, let's say, directing or being monitoring the thing that is emerging, how do you keep a sense for yourself of what might matter or not matter in a situation where the process itself is designed that you will lose even your own sense of the beginning and the end? Do you have boundaries that you set yourself or for the work, or how do you keep a handle on it? I mean, particularly maybe even before it meets an audience.
I mean, mostly, I think the way that I've worked on the long things has been that what one's doing is building a sort of set of rules, or you know, frames inside which performers will make individual decisions, and so the sort of liveliness and emerging structure of the thing will be out of the meeting of the intentions of all of the different people who are performing those pieces. And I think what's important is that every player, certainly in the Forced Entertainment team, plays those games, those structures differently. Like if I'm performing, I play one way, Terry will play another way, Kathy will play another way, Robin will play another way. And it's in the imbalance and the sort of negotiation that the sort of dynamic edge of those things is, we have conversations, much as a football team, I suppose, might have a conversation about how to play, but it's sort of slightly beyond legislation. And I don't know, we often come off from the long pieces, like the storytelling piece Adrian was talking about. There'll be a lot of discussion, but you rarely find that people agree on what went right and what went wrong. It's what all you do is, you concoct the rules in the way that you can, and then hope that the game goes well. And that's what's also exciting about it to me, is that most of what I would call the theatre work, we improvise and then we fix. So, and the fixed work is very fixed. It's insanely fixed. Those long pieces, they're only ever a system in which you agree to behave together for a length of time. And you have ambitions, you might have dramaturgical goals, or you have tactical things that you've sort of chattered about, but in the event it's all rather up for grabs. And I think very often in the middle of those pieces you find yourself on the stage thinking, I have no idea in my head, I have nothing now, this is like I have no stories to tell, I've got no clue where we should be going. And that's great, that's the place you're looking for, how you dig yourself out of that hole.
The choreographer Deborah Hay has a very nice articulation of how she arrives at the sense of the performance that she's going to give. That I can paraphrase her, but that she finds what she describes as uninteresting sequences of movement, which by returning again and again to them, I think she says, inform her of the unity of the dance. So there's something about long duration of practice, which isn't trying to squeeze unity or meaning or out of the material, but is allowing the material to, in a sense, teach her. But let's say when you're performing, Tim, how do you then negotiate the fact that you are developing a mastery inevitably of the situation into which you have propelled yourself, even though that situation is designed to refuse the mastery, because the mastery, there will be a certain mastering of the situation that emerges.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of those long pieces, 12 a.m. we've been doing since '93, so that's a long time. We don't do it very often. And I think maybe what's interesting about all of those works is that the structures, yes, you certainly develop some ways of doing and some moves that are familiar to you, but maybe the good thing is that the nature of the task, the unpredictability of the other players and the unpredictability of the audience means you're always wrong-footed. Right. You can be a brilliant professional footballer with a lot of tricks, can't you? But you're not going to win every game, and that's you're going to find yourself in situations that are slipping out of your hands, and that's the mark of what for us is a good system, is that it will generate like upset, and it will throw you off, and maybe that's the point. I think certainly see things sometimes where you think, well, you know, that's all well and good, but actually I can see that you could keep doing that forever, and there's very little at stake because plod, plod, plod.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, this is, for me, I would say, of course, not everything done over long duration is interesting. So what is it? What else are you talking about?
Yeah.
And this sense of what is the thing that generates change? What is the thing that generates or activates risk of one kind or another? What is it about this that's I mean, perilous, but I don't mean like walking on a razor blade. I'm talking about perilous in the sense of there's an instability, because just doing a boring thing over a long time, I mean, that in a way takes you back to the sort of endurance art kind of, well, yeah, you can do that, but so what? You know, like it doesn't really matter. So that's what's interesting to me is sort of, as you know, duration's only one of your factors, isn't it? It's interesting to think what else is going on.
I mean, Mick Taussig has this fantastic phrase in one of his later books, mastery of non-mastery. I mean, he's talking about it in relationship to kind of responses to climate crisis, and one way to think about the relationship between the human subject and the environment and planetary realities as a kind of strategy, basically, or tactic in relation to living on in a situation, in a catastrophic situation. And I think it's very appropriate, actually, that phrase in relationship to the kind of aesthetics that you're engaged with, Tim, because you know, one of the things that's really evident when you're in the room, either in rehearsal or even if you dared on the odd occasion to be on the stage in that context, is that you're dealing with a collective of people with 40 years of improvisational experience. And that is a deeply embodied set of collective knowledges, relational knowledges, individual knowledges as well. And improvising or performing in that context is a very, it is an incredibly rich, but also very challenging and weighty moment, right? And that may seem to the visitor, the spectator, quite invisible, right? We can't see any of that potentially, but actually what we're experiencing is a set of people with, you know, a myriad of possibilities of tactics and strategies and potential in any single moment of encounter, and also a whole accumulated shared set of knowledges of the kind of event course that those choices could take if they happen. And that's something very, very different from, I don't know, you know, starting out and making work, you know, knowing what it is that you could do or asking yourself what you could do.
That's interesting. I mean, the other thing that's making me think of is just around this question of mastery and what you're saying, the mastery of non-mastery. I'm thinking there's something in a degree of comfort being seen to fail. And like, I think that's something that as performers, you definitely have accumulated over long periods of time, is that it's not a big deal. Whereas I think for some people to be in those situations of those long pieces where, yeah, suddenly for the next 15 minutes is quite sticky. I think for us, yeah, it's sticky, but you're also kind of used to it. So you know that you can manage that and you can be in it and you're just there doing your job, you know, so that's fine. But actually, that's the thing, right? When me and Meg Stewart did a duet, which we made years ago, but we still do occasionally. We were improvising a lot. It's quite fixed now. But before we went on, I used to be nervous, but I used to just say to myself when I walked on with Meg, I'd be like, we're both carrying with us everything that we've ever done.
Mm.
And basically, it kind of can't go wrong, because if it goes this way or that way, I think we'll find a way to, you know, we'll make it happen. And I like that feeling, and that's maybe that situation that Adrian's talking about. Is it's not like you've got some fancy moves to do or a brilliant solution for everything, but you are comfortable to be there and do your work. And that's a different feeling. And maybe the durational work in general opens up that, for me, that possibility is you haven't got a preordained dramaturgy you're trying to hit. What you have got is a task, time, people, and go. And there's something sort of grounding about that I appreciate.
I'm not sure we've come up to the end of the first hour, and then we're going to open up to any questions from people listening. I'm going to have to disappear because I have to go and teach. So thank you, Tim and Adrian, for this. Well, I find myself rethinking my own experiences and approaches just listening to this exchange between each of you. And I'm going to hand over to my collaborator Kerry. I'll disappear, but hopefully you'll have an interesting next half an hour with questions. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, take care. Yes, as Jonathan said, if anybody would like to place any conversations or things in the chat, then please do so. Equally, you can put your camera on. It might be nice to hear from you in person. But yes, just while people are kind of thinking through, I was just struck then in terms of what you were saying, both Adrian and Tim, given our attention economy, I just wonder, with the immediacy of our online cultures, do you fear or do you ever worry about kind of durational performance being at risk? Or does that not worry you?
I don't know. I mean, I think in one sense, I feel like we're probably at a place where there's almost some kind of extra value being added to live work in general, and maybe to these sort of very, in a way, more, I don't want to say extreme, but, you know, live works that pose a different kind of challenge or offer a different kind of experience. And I think people are sort of hungry for that, maybe as a counterweight to the sort of relentless pace and digital presence. I think I could imagine that, you know, as a groove, whilst everything is more and more online and more AI, that, you know, actual bodies in actual places and gatherings of people that are actual will continue to have a currency, and maybe a bigger currency in a niche groove or something. I mean, then on top of that, I think there's a certain kind of spectacularization. I mean, it's interesting, you know, Venice this year, 3 people out of performance leading, you know, Florentina, Holtzinger, Meet Warlock from Belgium, and Dries Verhoeven from Netherlands, all really coming out of theatre performance, dance theatre performance, leading the sort of Biennale presentations. And I think there's on a certain level, there's a great appetite for that. How it meets the challenge of the sort of industrial level of production you have to do in situations like that, I think it's a tricky question. But it's interesting that there's an appetite for that, I think.
Adrian, do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I'm just struggling with random drilling in the background. So if it comes through, I apologize, but maybe the filter will grab it. I feel very ambivalent. I mean, in a sense, I feel like we've entered a kind of phase of biopower that feels very different to the previous eras of biopower, and I'm very conscious of the way in which I feel as if I may be a subject in a kind of technological experiment with human subjectivity that is whose human consequences and whose ecological consequences and whose social and psychological consequences are completely unknown. And I do feel that my capacity to be attentive, which is, I think, also what was being discussed in relationship to technologies in the last conversation. My capacity to be attentive is being shifted and altered, and and consequently, I have a need to be ever more disciplined and to affiliate with those kind of the countercultures, in a sense of attention resistance and of slowness that we've been talking about. And I do see signs of those cultures, and of digital detox and digital switch off, and people creating different kinds of scenes of relation that have a kind of political and cultural force in relationship to those powers. But yeah, I probably have quite a dark sense of where it might be heading for the human species at this point in its relationship to technologies. And so I'm constantly kind of oscillating in my thinking about both the potential of art and performance and social practices to resist these kinds of forms of fracking or extraction, since they really are under the skin at this point and into our kind of neural reality. And that, I think, is the very difficult situation we face. So that's my sense of the risk. Sorry.
No, thank you. Shrinker, thank you. Did you want to speak, or shall I read that out? Is Shrinker there? Okay, I'll read.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, you can read it. No, you can read it. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. So Shrinker said, thanks for such a rich conversation. Many thoughts were emerging, but I was left with one that's been haunting me. Perhaps it's worth sharing. So I'm wondering whether any of you have come across work that thinks reflection, interruption, or disorientation through acceleration rather than slowness. I'm thinking here of, acute accelerationism by Ireland and Chronic, where acceleration understood not simply as speed, spectacle, or productivity, but as a process that generates mutations and new forms of subjectivity. Interesting. Do you have Tim or Adrian, over to you.
I mean, I think that's always in my mind been the two strands, the two directions. Really, there's been an interest in making work and in seeing work that takes the slow route to these kinds of like resetting or opening new possibilities. I think the other way has always been, for me, interesting to think about overloads and about speed and about getting to new ways of thinking that are generated in those kinds of ways, and I do value that as a kind of compositional approach, because of the way that it it's a different route, but I think the goal is probably similar in the sense that it's about trying to make or to see work that open space precisely by overload rather than underload.
Yeah, for me, I think it's a really deep aesthetic vein, and I mean, you know, I would think of it, Tim, for instance, in relationship to, say, a group in experimental theatre like the Worcester Group, where you always have this kind of aesthetics, which is entirely based on ultra precise realization of multiple actions, in multiple screens, overlaying simultaneously, relentlessly. So a kind of accelerated aesthetic, which then gets you into a kind of shifted time, experiential time. But it's also there, for instance, in some of the artists that I've been working with. I mean, I'm thinking of someone like Tehching Hsieh, the guy who made the one-year-long performances in the late 70s and early 1980s. I'm thinking in particular of his time clock piece, in which a whole year of time is condensed into a 6-minute film. He clocks onto a worker's time clock on the hour every hour, takes a still on a 16mm film camera. And so what we see in the 6-minute film is this extraordinary vibration of time passing through a body, time moving excessively fast, taking us into a different kind of sense relation with that body. And in the installation of that work, that acceleration is counterposed with the documents of the long duration, the kind of micro detail of this long time spent. So I think there are many aesthetic means through which a kind of accelerated senses of acceleration can be invoked that perhaps might be turned towards examining the logics of acceleration itself. So yeah, I think it's definitely a possibility. I mean, where I perhaps would step away a little bit from some of the accelerationist thought is its kind of relationship to a kind of curative idea of catastrophe, and you know, in a sense where this might lead to is a kind of situation of total collapse, and in which something new would arise. And anyway, that's a different kind of question, but it's in terms of aesthetics, I think it's a very rich terrain.
Thank you very much.
The questions, I can see Suzanne is typing. Oh yeah, Suzanne, did you want to? Suzanne?
No, that was rather a comment, yeah. Because also Jonathan earlier posed the gender question, and yeah, we could also, and he sort of hinted at this idea, or perhaps also more explicitly, what kind of mastery is this? Also perhaps slowness in a kind of, yeah, sorry if my saying so, but also in a white male narrative. And in a way, André Lepecki also hints at that when talking about Bruce Nauman and this idea of the slow, solo, solipsistic choreographer. And I found it so interesting is sort of this kind of the impact it has upon you if you have to endure something as an audience, like the extreme slowness, like partly also Jérôme Bell, but then also Miriam Gourfink, and these performers in the late 90s where you really have the feeling you have to go through that, and the impact, which sometimes is perhaps also a bit violent upon you. And I had a similar impression this weekend. I've just came from the 10th Biennale with what I've wrote Nora Chipomira's work, and she's from, sorry, I forgot the country, from Africa, and works with Black performers. And that was quite a different physicality where it was sort of, there was so much going on, and really for half an hour. And I seldomly had the feeling that, wow, do I stay? Because it was like constantly props falling around and sets going up and down, and the performers everywhere, and really morphing between playing football, between chasing each other. It could have been violent. And you were really constantly in between, also pushed to the side. And it was also a very long piece, like 2.5 hours, but with different speeds. But this was also something where I thought, being sort of into this together and then again not, and whether this kind of impact is perhaps a similar thing, or perhaps an expansion of this idea of slowness, mastery, because also here, I mean, they were the masters of what they did, and then again not, but it, of course, it also questions a lot my own mastery of being an obedient, knowledgeable, whatever, ... audience.
Mm.
That's just a comment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say also for in relationship to the whiteness of the narratives of durational performance as well. In fact, one of the dimensions of the work I've been doing has been an attempt to recover, in fact, a relation between racially subjected artists and white orders, both of artistry and also of society and of culture. There is, in fact, a deep affinity in the histories of artists of color with this strategy, in a sense, of undergoing and of subjection, right? Which has a deep relationship to a form of resistance. And in fact, even if you look at, for instance, someone like Tehching Hsieh, who I was mentioning earlier, these one-year-long performances that are very much plunging into a kind of lived condition of partial visibility or of invisibility in some ways, that are relentlessly documented. One of the reasons why Hsieh documents, why he keeps the record, why he keeps the capacity for visibility, is that he knew that as an undocumented brown art worker in the late 70s and early 80s, his work would not be believed. No one would believe that he had done this. And so he keeps this kind of relationship to orders of visibility, to the document, to the archive, to historical narration, whilst at the same time questioning how he may be made visible. Right? And that is, I think, the one of the veins of a kind of practice of undergoing in artwork that has really to do. You might say it's very connected to what Glissant calls the right to opacity, the right to remain in the space between the visible and the invisible, to not be fully disclosed, but to find agency, as it were, nonetheless, in that space.
Tim, did you want to? No, it was just a comment, but thank you, Suzanne. Brilliant. Any other questions? So I wonder, is there any kind of final thoughts that you'd like to kind of leave us with? I'm aware that we're coming towards the end of time for those that aren't here but are going to watch later on.
So we have time. we have time to think of it in other times as well. And no, but I think it's just it's always a tremendously rich conversation to have for me, Tim, and also I would say this to Jonathan, who's absent, because I really start to understand the kind of micro differences between practices, but also the different languages which artists bring to these kinds of questions. And I just think it's this is a tremendously rich space of conversation to stay in. So I'm really grateful for it. And just to say also that to be in the long duration of the conversations is really meaningful as well, because in a sense there is a kind of tracking of the shifts of language and perspective that have taken place over many years. And I'm seeing that in the work that you're doing now, Tim, with AI and with these morphologies of voice that really question the relationship between technology and embodiment, that the way that you're questioning the experience of the event is completely changing. And it's very I'm just sort of trying now to kind of to think about relationships of early experiences of your work that were very much about kind of the excess of the experience, what you're referring to as the capacity of the performance to problematize itself as an object, was very much to do with a certain kind of youthful physicality and exuberance and physical excessiveness. And now the work has entered a kind of different age of bodies, a different reality of a different corpo reality, like collective corpo reality, but also a different cultural and technological age. And to see as kind of imperatives still being pursued, still being driven it's just a really exciting thing.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I mean, it is amazing to be looping back into conversation with you and with Jonathan on these topics. One of the things I was thinking about in terms of duration is the this 40+ year long project of the company, and one of the things that has changed for sure in that time is the way that we as a group of makers and performers are in our bodies, and for sure I think that it's very interesting doing the durational pieces because they challenge us in ways now that they didn't challenge us, different ways than the ways that they challenged us when we were in our sort of late 20s when we first made those pieces. And what's interesting about the long works is that because they're improvised, I feel like we're making them anew every time we do them. And I have no doubt that if one was to compare the way that those pieces operate and sit now compared to how 12 AM sat in 1993, if you compared the videos, I think it'd be very interesting to see in a way what's changed and what stayed the same. But I'm interested in the way that as older bodies and as older thinking consciousnesses, how we're approaching those things are changing in this new space. Likewise, as Adrian's saying, the work with the AI voices, I think, yeah, there's definitely a move away from, in those early works, this sort of youthful exuberance, as Adrian called it, to this sense of bodies that have definitely got limits, and bodies that have to be seen in relation to sort of technological apparatuses. You know, that in these last three pieces, their presences are only half the picture, if you like. It's very much about this sort of ungainly negotiation between present human performers and absent non-human voices that are pretending to be human, and the temporality of those and the texture of those being both familiar in one sense and alien. And I think that's very much the reality that we're finding ourselves in, you know, on a day-to-day basis. So it's the work's changing, I think, in order to try to meet that, for sure.
Thank you both so much. I'm aware that we've got a few minutes left, so I don't think there's any more questions. I suppose I just feel like saying thank you to the elders of these very important durational practices. So personally, crikey, I've learned so much, and yeah, so huge thanks to both of you for being here. And again, huge thanks to Jonathan for curating this series. It's been wonderful to work with him. Thanks to Cedar for making this happen. And yeah, stay tuned. This is the last talk, but I think there's all sorts of other rich things that have come out of this. I think particularly dance and resistance. I think that's something that we can move forwards with. So yeah, thank you all very much for joining us. And yeah, lovely to meet you, and thank you.
Ciao, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.